Hey, everybody, and happy Friday. Thank you for joining us today for the first week of the 2026 ARC Michigan Disability Policy webinars. My name is Emily Mullins. I work for Michigan Alliance for Family, which is a project of the ARC Michigan. Before we get started here, a few reminders about the platform we're using today, Zoom webinar. If you need any tech support during this webinar, you can message me using the chat feature. Attendees will remain muted for this presentation, but feel free to enter your questions or comments on today's webinar topics in the chat during the presentation. There will be time for questions. We'll also be sharing links in the chat and presenter contact info. If you've joined us via the app on your phone, look for the pull-down menu at the top or bottom of your screen to access these features. Automated captions are available, and you have the option to translate those captions into a different language by clicking the little caret next to the CC button to access those options. Now, let me hand this over to Sherry Boyd, Executive Director of the ARC Michigan. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Emily. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you for attending our first session of our public policy seminars that we're offering in June. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to talk briefly about an action alert that we have out there along with the DCW Coalition. We are really working to make sure that there is money, the right amount of money is in the 2027 budget so that direct care workers can make the required wage of $18.40 an hour. We have concerns that there isn't enough money in the budget. So if you could take a moment and fill out the link, I believe someone's going to put it in the chat. Or you can scan the QR code that's up on the screen at the moment, or you will get this on our website. This whole presentation will be on the website after today. So thank you. Again, please fill it out. It's really important that folks hear from people about this issue so that we can have a chance to make some changes to the 27 budget. Having said all that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Gable, who is the Director of Litigation at Disability Rights Michigan. He leads their systemic litigation in efforts to try to make life better for people with disabilities in Michigan. And obviously, DRM and Nick are focusing on inclusion and access to services and all the things that are really important to the ARC Michigan and to people with disabilities and their families across Michigan. So having said all that, please welcome Nick, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thanks, Sherry. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Nick Gable. I'm the litigation director at DRM. Just a couple words about DRM itself before I get into it. For those who don't know, we're Michigan's protection and advocacy system. There's one in every U.S. state and territory. And we're mandated by federal law to protect the rights of people with disabilities. And that protection takes many different forms. We have an institutional rights team that investigates abuse and neglect. We have a rep payee team that's focused on making sure that Social Security beneficiaries aren't taken advantage of by their payees. We have an employment team that focuses on Michigan Rehabilitation Services work. We have the legal team and we have an employment team. And we do, within legal, quite a bit of different things. But one of our priorities, and the one relevant to this presentation, is making sure that people have access to Medicaid services. And the Wasco litigation is, well, it's been going on for about 11 years now. It's a case that I filed back in March 2016. And that we've been litigating with our co-counsel, Ed Krugman, since then. It's involved 2 appeals to the Sixth Circuit, the second of which expanded the scope of the ADA's integration mandate. It involved extensive discovery, and it eventually resulted in a consent decree with the state. And this presentation addresses the settlement that was reached with the state. And unfortunately, some of the problems we've encountered implementing it. I'm going to share my screen, put up some slides. Go to slideshow view. Okay. Um, we have done this presentation many times across the state. It's geared toward recipients impacted by the settlement, but we've also given this presentation to CMHs and PHPs. So a lot of it, as you'll see, is directed toward recipients, but the information is applicable to everybody. And a little bit of background before I get into it. Under the consent decree, there were two possible ways the settlement could go. The first was minimum fee schedules, where there would be a set rate, minimum rate for CLS of $31 an hour that would apply to every habilitation supports waiver self-determination CLS recipient. One of the contingencies for that to happen was that the Region 6 PHP sign a new contract, and of course it didn't. And so instead of the $31 an hour across the board, which would have been administratively much easier, we went to a costing out regime, which is what, in our view, the HAB waiver has always required. But that, unfortunately, it's not nearly as easy to deal with for recipients. And so the point of this presentation is to make people aware of their new rights, how the process is supposed to go, and to let people know about some of the issues we've encountered enforcing these policies against the Washtenaw CMH in the litigation. So these slides are all going to deal with costing out. And the main points are that the CLS budget and the IPOS go hand in hand. They're developed in conjunction with each other, and they have to be done as part of person-centered planning. What happened before, at least in Washtenaw County, was that people would be given a all-inclusive rate. Initially, it was $13.88, I think, back in 2015, and told that they had to fit their IPOS within the rate. And what happened, of course, was that people couldn't hire staff or retain staff at the wages they could offer under 1388. And they also frequently couldn't pay for activities or transportation or other costs that the IPOS required. And when they encountered that issue, they would be sent to their fiscal intermediary, who would then say, well, if you want to pay your staff $11 an hour, you can't go to the bowling alley, or whatever the case. One of the main things we wanted to do was take this all back to the person-centered planning process where it should be done, and not let CMHs punt to the fiscal intermediaries. Costing out means what it sounds like. It means that whatever CLS has been determined to be medically necessary as part of the IPOS should be budgeted. And that means budgeted on a line-by-line basis based on the different components of the service. And by components, I mean what you pay staff, what activities cost, what transportation costs, what your non-payroll expenses are, etc. And so now you should have transportation activities designated in the plan as part of the service and separately costed out in your budget. And if there's a disagreement about a specific item, like a specific activity or a specific wage or whatever the case, you're entitled to go to a hearing to challenge it. The problem right now, and I'll get into this later, is that there are so many structural issues with the way the Washtenaw CMH is doing this that a fair hearing wouldn't work. We're trying to get to the point where the process works the way it should so that people who do have disputes within the process can go to a hearing. Um, this is some initial advice about how to handle this, and we'll get into details later. But the main thing I want people to remember is documentation before the meeting, at the meeting, and after the meeting. This requires more work from recipients. You need to go into the PCP meeting with a good idea of what you need. And you need to do it um, in a detailed way that doesn't just say, I need, let's say I need a rate of $35 an hour or $30 an hour. You need to say, this is what I need to be able to pay staff. These are the activities I need. This is the transportation I need. And everything should be justified by medical necessity. We'll talk about medical necessity later, but that's what this all comes back to. When you go to the meeting, keep good notes. We've had people record these meetings and then transcribe them and document what happens after the meeting. Because in terms of process issues, documenting how the meeting goes is really important. All right, this is the basic formula. Staff wages, what you're paying your workers, activities and tasks, which are the scope of CLS, and transportation. And so, for example, you might have, uh, let's say, a weekly trip to a particular restaurant in the IPOS where the recipient knows the staff, practices certain skills, is out in the community, whatever the case. In that case, you would have the wage component, so what the CLS worker who goes there gets paid. You have the cost of going to the restaurant, which would include the cost for the recipient and the staff, and then you have the cost to get there and back. One thing to note is that transportation is not from the CLS workers' residence to the recipient's residence. It's from the home of the recipient to the activities, for example. You want to be specific in the IPOS, and it's always going to depend on the individual. The other thing to remember, aside from documentation, is individualized. What activities you need, what staff wage you need, transportation, it's always going to depend on that person. You can't make generalizations about what any particular person needs. And the whole point is that this should be done in an individualized way in person-centered planning. And so we have examples here like gym fees, movie tickets, meals at restaurants. Some or none of those could be applicable to any given person. It really depends on the person. It depends on where they live. It depends on what they like to do. It depends on what activities develop certain skills or further their goals, increase their community integration. Again, it's always going to be individualized. But whatever those specific activities may be, you want to put in the IPOS or try to get in the IPOS with the appropriate justification. And different activities have different costs and they have different frequencies. Somebody might go to the gym once a week, and the gym fee might have an annual membership cost. Somebody might go to the movies once a week, and that's just a single weekly cost. Again, you'll have to sort that out for each activity. We have found that there's lots of pushback on activities, and the reason is that CMHs generally used all-inclusive rates that were set administratively without regard to individual need. And so activities feel like a lot of increased cost to the CMHs now. And there's lots of allegations that the activities people want are excessive or unnecessary. And again, each activity should be justified based on medical necessity. The key is you need to figure out what the recipient needs based on, I mean, I'll say it a million times, the medical necessity criteria, and trying to be, reasonable within the bounds of Medicaid and what is being a good steward of Medicaid dollars while still meeting somebody's needs. Um, I just said this. I'm going to go to the next slide. We're going to talk about medical necessity later. Right now, um, these criteria are in the behavioral health chapter of the Medicaid provider manual. It's available online, but it's a massive document, difficult to use. These slides will be available after, and so you can refer to them here if it's easier. But the things to note with these criteria, which control the amount, scope, and duration of a CLS service, is that they're endors. And so you don't need to meet all of these criteria, and you don't even need to meet some of them, most of them. You do need to meet at least one of them. And the key ones to really focus on are the third bullet and the fifth one, which we have highlighted. And you want to think about activities in relation to these standards. Intended to treat, ameliorate, diminish, or stabilize symptoms of mental illness, DD, or substance use disorder. And the last part obviously is not going to be really applicable to this population. Designed to assist the beneficiary to maintain or retain sufficient level of functioning to achieve goals of community inclusion and participation, independent recovery, productivity. The whole point of CLS is for people to be integrated in their communities and to be as independent as they can. And a lot of times, involvement in the community itself ameliorates or stabilizes symptoms of DD. That's something to keep in mind. Another thing is that a lot of times, a certain frequency and type of community integration is necessary for somebody to stay there and to keep doing the things they want to do. And that's really where that last bullet point comes in. You should think about these things in relation to specific activities, but a lot of times the different activities in a plan work together. And you should think about it that way too. The CMHs so far, at least as far as we've seen, are very restrictive about what activities are medically necessary. And they impose criteria that go beyond the medical necessity criteria we just looked at. They attach all sorts of other requirements to them, like specifically redressing a functional impairment, for example. Again, the medical necessity criteria control, and those are what you should focus on when you're in a PCP meeting. These are some examples of ways the IPOS could provide for activities. And I'll note here with this first bullet point that not all activities cost money. Some people enjoy things that don't cost money. For example, going to a park. But in my experience, the answer that CMHs tend to have to every request is say, go walk in the park or something like that. And that's not appropriate. It's not individualized and it's not what people necessarily need. And the second bullet point illustrates that because sometimes you need to be in a place where there's lots of people to focus on being safe. You need to be in a busy area to focus on skills that involve safety. You need to be in a place where you can interact with people without disabilities to the same extent that people without disabilities do. And the goal is for people to be able to live as normal of a life as they can. These are some examples: bowling, movie, going to a gym, restaurants, things like that. Again, it's always going to depend on the individual. This last bullet, I think, is particularly helpful because it shows some of the skill and goal related things that bowling addresses. That's not going to be the case for everybody. You really have to know the recipient. And that's what PCP is all about. Transportation should be straightforward. It's attached to activities in the plan. You could have an activity that doesn't cost money itself, but it requires money to get there. Usually you're going to be looking at mileage reimbursement. But for some people, maybe public transportation works, or maybe it's a place you can walk to. Uh, It all depends on the individual. The one thing you should be prepared for is pushback when it comes to less costly alternatives. So, for example, let's say you have somebody who wants to go by car to the mall for an activity, and the CMH comes back and says, "We're not going to pay for you to drive there, but there's a bus you can take." Well, maybe that works for the person, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe the person is not capable of being on a bus with a lot of other people for that amount of time. It will always depend. And you need to be ready in the PCP meeting to say these things, to explain them. And it's supposed to be a conversation with the CMH where you get to the point where you want to be. Um, Staff wages, the this is this is an involved question. It's not necessarily as straightforward as activity costs. Um, I sound like a broken record, but individualization is the key. Uh, what you need to pay somebody to hire them and get the service will depend on where the person lives. It'll depend on their level of need. People with higher needs tend to uh, require higher paid staff because it's harder to find and retain people. Um, any number of considerations go into this. And the new policies, which are in the Medicaid provider manual, have a list of criteria that have to be considered as part of this decision. Um, People who have done self-determination for a long time usually know what they need. They've hired enough people or tried to hire enough people. They've posted, they've talked to other people. They know what similarly situated people pay. Um, these are all relevant considerations, but there is some legwork that you have to do. Um, these are the considerations right here. They're straight out of the policy. They're pretty self-explanatory, but you're basically gathering data to support what wage you need to hire people. Now, if you can hire somebody for $25 an hour who is appropriate and suits the recipient, you're not entitled to $30, right? This shouldn't be a windfall. You it should be you get what you need to hire people. No less, no more. And that's going to depend on the recipient, it's going to depend on the staff. So these are the things you can look at. Um, Obviously, you don't need to pay the same wage to each staffer. You might have somebody who's worked for you for 5 years, who's only going to stay if they get a modest raise. Um, and that person probably should be paid more than somebody you just hired. Um, you want to be reasonable at the same time. You want to get what you need, and um, as with everything else, you need to be prepared. If you've posted for jobs on care.com, for example, and you've offered $20 and everybody has come back and said, I'll do it for 25, print those out and bring them to the meeting. Um, if you have interviewed people and in the interviews they said, yeah, I mean, I could do it for 25, but I really need some sort of subsidy for my health care or whatever the case, take that back. Um, if somebody you hired somebody at 25 or 20 or whatever the case, and they weren't able to stick it out because the behavioral needs were just too high, and you've gone through something like that a couple times, those are data points that you should bring to the PCP meeting. All right. Now, in terms of staffing costs, there's payroll. I mean, there's what the person gets paid, and then there's also other expenses. And some of these are mandatory, some of them are not. Uh, the mandatory ones are unemployment, Social Security, Medicare, taxes, workers' comp, ESTA. But some people can offer additional paid time off, health coverage, things like that. The key thing here is that even though fiscal intermediaries are no longer setting budgets because that's something you do in PCP, they're a great resource when it comes to stuff like this. And they can help you identify what you need to have in there, uh, and how that will fit with everything else you're doing. Here's an example of payroll expenses. Um, a couple things to note here. The staff work different hours per week and they have different wages. Like I said before, it's going to depend on the recipient, it's going to depend on the staff. But all of these are annualized, and there's your total payroll expenses. These are the non-payroll expenses that we were just talking about. It's the same principle. You figure out what they cost, you add them up, you combine them with payroll, there's your staffing cost. A quick note about supports brokers. These are not part of CLS. They're paid using a different code, but they can be a really helpful resource when it comes to navigating the PCP process and putting together an IPOS and a budget. All right, activities and transportation. Here's a basic example. And the things to note here are the frequency and how you annualize. So with weekly music lessons, you're $35 a week. The gym membership is one time per year, and the miscellaneous is $200 a month. You take those, you annualize them, you add them together. Um, you really, I said this before, but you really want to tie community inclusion activities to goals or skills. Sometimes it's both. Um, that is relevant to the medical necessity criteria. Um, and be reasonable. I'm not saying don't ask for things that the person needs, but you always want to be reasonable to the extent that you can. All right. This is how you would do the transportation, which is derived from the activities. Um, you're taking the frequency, you're annualizing it, and in this case, it's only mileage. And then everything gets added together. You create an annualized cost. And when you divide that by the number of authorized hours, you come to a total rate for the service, not to be confused with a staff rate. The staff rate is part of that total rate, but the CLS rate encompasses everything on the service. And in this case, it's 33.44 an hour, which is in the ballpark of the rates that we've seen people propose. And it's in line with what the minimum fee schedules would have required. Okay. This is done through the person-centered planning process. For people whose IPOS years are ending, you'll have a PCP meeting for the new one. People can also request to reopen PCP if the IPOS isn't doing it. Document staff wages, activity costs, transportation, gather all of that stuff and come to the meeting with them. And be prepared to go through things on an individual basis with the supports coordinator. The way it should work is you have a discussion, and the supports coordinator says something like, well, do you really need to go to this particular restaurant twice a week? And you come back and you say, yes. And you explain why, and you have a discussion. All of this should be done within the PCP process so that there can be a full discussion and there can be a proper determination of the application of medical necessity criteria to what's being requested. We've had people record meetings. It tends to be helpful when you're trying to go forward, and you didn't, the PCP process didn't work the way it should have. One key point here is that the new policies under the settlement require that utilization management not displace the PCP process. Unfortunately, what we've seen happen is that the PCP process is truncated. Uh, the supports coordinators are there to gather information, take it back to the actual decision makers, outside of the process. That's not how it should work. All right. Now, assuming we have a process that works the way it should, you've had a full PCP meeting, you've had a full discussion, and if you have a denial of, let's say, the number of hours, or let's say a specific activity or transportation, whatever the case, you're entitled to a budget and an IPOS, and the IPOS has to have a special section that says request not approved. Uh, the determination has to be individualized and based on medical necessity, and you're entitled to an adverse benefit determination that concretely sets forth the reasoning for the denial. Concrete means it has to be a specific reason tied to the specific request. It can't just say something like not medically necessary. And of course, before there's a reduction of an authorized budget, you have to get a written and specific justification. And as always, in that case, you're entitled to advance notice and the right to get benefits pending a hearing. In the event of a dispute about the budget gets set at the preceding budget pending an appeal. And because this is managed care, you have to go through a local appeal with the CMH and then a state fair hearing. This is something that this slide is one that we added based on our experience with Washington CMH recently. They bifurcate the IPOS and the budget. They give people a budget, but people don't see the IPOS, and they don't see they don't have any way of knowing what was specifically denied. They can't evaluate it in relation to the budget. That's not supposed to happen. Both are supposed to happen at the same time, and you're supposed to be able to evaluate your budget in relation to the IPOS. These are some of the process issues we've seen. I mentioned one of them with utilization management. Another thing we've seen is wage ranges that are set in advance based on things like agency providers. And instead of being an individualized, person-centered discussion based on what that person needs to hire, there's a priori assumption about what range is permissible, and then the burden is put on the person to justify going outside of it. That's not how it should work. I mentioned impermissible medical necessity criteria, quite a bit of that. Very restrictive views of activities and medical necessity. Not including requests not approved, ABDs that are not issued at all, or when they are, they're not specific. And like I just said, not getting the budget in the IPOS. Just a quick note about goods and services. This is not the same as paying for an activity as part of CLS. And the policy for goods and services is in the process of being changed, but as of now, it still requires the good or the service to substitute for human assistance. It's never been completely clear what the goods and service policy means, but it does appear to mean that if it's something that would be done through CLS, where you have human assistance in the form of workers, goods and services is not appropriate for it. Okay, and stepping away from the budget process for a moment, there are new self-determination rights and new hearing rights. The first one has to do with self-determination. So for a long time, self-determination could be terminated and you had no right to go to a Medicaid fair hearing challenging it. Now you do. And not only that, but there's a process that the CMH has to go through before it terminates. You're entitled to written notice, meaningful problem solving, and if the termination goes forward, nevertheless, you're entitled to advance notice and a hearing. And part of advance notice is benefits pending, meaning you can maintain the arrangement pending the hearing decision. Um, and if you win at the hearing, the judge has to order a continuation of the arrangement. So this is a significant protection for people who could be threatened with termination of self direction. In some cases, as we've seen, because of the CMH's failures to do what it's supposed to do. Also, if the process works the way it's supposed to, and you end up with a specific, legitimate dispute about the medical necessity of an activity or transportation or whatever the case, you can go to a hearing, and as far as the number of hours or the budget is concerned, the ALJ can not only reverse the CMH, but it can order a specific number of hours or a budget. This was done to fix what we called the Medicaid fair hearing hamster wheel, where somebody would go to a hearing and the ALJ would say, I agree, you're entitled to 20 hours, or yeah, sure, you're entitled to 20 hours, not 10 hours. I'm going to reverse. But then instead of an order requiring 20 hours, it would get sent back to the CMH for a reassessment. The CMH would reassess and say, okay, here's 10 hours. Technically, it complied with the order, and people wouldn't have any recourse but to request another hearing and keep going through the process. The point of this is to change that and make sure that when people do have a dispute, they can go to a hearing and get the relief they need. Of course, the CMH could win at the hearing, and that's fine. That's the process working the way it's supposed to as well. You would need to show that you're entitled at the hearing to that budget determination or that number of hours. It's not automatic. Another thing in relation to this is that the ALJs can also order specific relief concerning the ratio of CLS and OHSS, overnight health and safety. It's particularly important because OHSS will frequently be at a lower rate than the CLS, and the tendency will be to push people into OHSS even where CLS is really what's needed. Because let's say, for example, somebody gets up 20 times a night and needs lots of CLS type assistance during that time. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is specific to the Washtenaw CMH. It's something we've been dealing with specifically as part of the litigation and our attempts to enforce the policies against this CMH. I'll briefly talk about some of it just to show some of the problems that we've seen. I'm not going to say much about this flowchart because it doesn't make any sense. But the key thing here is that the PCP meetings we've seen involve a preset list of questions, no discussion, and then somebody else outside of the process saying, here's what we'll do. It comes back to the person and says, take it or leave it. That's not how it's supposed to work at all. This should be all done as part of the person-centered planning process, and utilization, making decisions exterior to the PCP process is also a violation of the policies. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, but people need to demand the discussion and not just accept, I'll take that back. What is the CMH's position? This is an example of the wage ranges we've seen. The $25 top of that range, we understand, is based on agency providers, which should not be part of the consideration at all. And people are being told that they have to justify it if they want to go above that. That's the opposite of the individualized determination that's supposed to be made. The activities um, I mentioned earlier the very restrictive view of activities. And this is an example of it. So, for example, uh, mapping onto objectives, increased community engagement alone, measurable skill-based objectives. Not everything is going to be tied to a skill-based objective. And increased community engagement could be medically necessary if it ameliorates somebody's DD. Uh, Again, medical necessity criteria would count, and CMH should not be imposing more restrictive criteria. Um, yeah, and it's the same with identified functional impairments. That's not something that appears in the criteria, stand for habilitative interventions. Uh, Enough said. These are the policies, but they are now in the Medicaid provider manual, in the behavioral health chapter, in the CLS chapter. Um, they're out there. They're accessible online, and uh, I think I'll stop there and stop sharing.
All right.
Uh,
Oh,
yep,
are you ready for questions now, Nick?
sure. And
Okay.
I should say in advance, let me just say this.
Mhm.
In a lot of the presentations that I've done on this, people understandably want individualized advice. I'm not in a position to do that, uh, partly because I don't know your situation, partly because this is so individualized. Um, there is a DHS email address that it's using to monitor compliance or lack thereof with the policies. And um, I suggest that people use it. To the extent that we have resources, we're able to give people advice and information at DRM. That has become more challenging lately, just because of our resources. But just wanted to put that out there up front.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick. All right. So to get started with our questions, just to back this up to the beginning, when does this take effect and does it cover everybody that receives services, that receive CLS services, or is this discussion only for people that are on the HAB waiver?
Only HAB waiver, only self-D, only CLS. That was the subject matter of the lawsuit, and we couldn't we couldn't go beyond that. Um, and yes, this is all effective, and not only is it effective now, but it has been since October 1st of last year. These requirements have all been binding on the CMHs since that time.
All right. Next question. Are CMHs allowed to set maximum budgets or limits on any sort of bonuses or limits on activity costs for people
No,
who are self-directing?
no. And in fact, one of probably the primary purpose of these policies is to prevent that sort of across the board use of uh, caps, whether it's for staff wages or activities or whatever the case. Individualization is the key here.
Um, what if you go through the IPOS process and then the budget later is changed by utilization management?
Um, well, it depends on what point we're talking about. If you're talking about before the IPOS has been signed, but you're in the PCP and utilization management is making a decision exterior to that process, that's a failure of the process, and it 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 affects your prospective rates in terms of, let me see, how do I say this? It's not a it hasn't been authorized yet, so it's a problem with the process and it affects your rights with respect to it. But it's not the same as if utilization management in the middle of an authorization term reduces your budget, in which case you're entitled to advance notice, a hearing, and to maintain the status quo pending the outcome of the hearing.
Thank you. Next question. Is there any burden on the case coordinator who's helping you develop the IPOS to help the family in determining these costs and activities, or is it all expected to fall on the individual?
I don't know if I would call it a burden, but I would say that it is the supports coordinator's role in the PCP process to have this discussion with people, to focus about on the medical necessity criteria, to focus on the specific requests, to discuss each of them with the person, and to be part of the decision that's made.
How could a independent facilitator help make the PCP process more effective?
Uh, well, an independent facilitator can be there to do some of the work that a supports coordinator should do and maybe isn't doing, for one thing. An independent facilitator could know the policies, could know the recipient, could help lead a discussion about the requests in relation to medical necessity. Um, those are all very concrete ways an independent facilitator could help.
All right, so going back to the actual budget and how things would work in real life. All right, so you figure out all of the costs. How do you actually, how does the money come through? How do you pay for bowling?
Well, the way it usually works is you use the service, and when you draw down money to pay for an hour of CLS, what the money you're drawing down has money for your staff wages, but also money for activities and for all that, because it's all part of the rate. And you submit to the fiscal intermediary for reimbursement of activities
Okay, so
that are authorized. Yeah.
you would need some sort of invoice or receipt to be reimbursed.
Yeah, I think that's generally the way it works. They submit receipts to the fiscal for authorized activities or transportation expenses.
Nick, are you okay if I chime in on what I'm seeing out in the world with that a little bit?
Of course.
Um, so,
If
um,
you want to pause first, you can turn on your camera and introduce yourself.
oh, sorry, I'm Jan Lampman. Um, and I have facilitated lots of person-centered plans across the state and have been working pretty closely with a lot of folks that are trying to do this costing out process. And Nick and I have worked on some things together. And so what I'm seeing in terms of that reimbursement is some of the FMS organizations are actually getting these prepaid debit cards. So like say you're going bowling once a week and it costs, I don't know, $20 or something, then they will load that card every week with the money you need for bowling, and then you just then submit the receipt after the fact. So they're trying to, the FMSs really are trying to come up with some creative ways to make sure you've got the money in hand. Because some people can't just pay and get reimbursed later, right? And
Right.
so the FMSs are really trying to work with folks to come up with ways to cover that. I think there's one FMS that actually has like a company credit card that they'll use to pay for things in advance and then, bill it to the proper person served. So there's a
Huh.
few different ways.
That's good to know. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Um, our next question is about you had given some tips like you can record a meeting and transcribe it later. Do you have to have consent? Do you need to
Uh,
inform them?
Michigan, I'm quite sure, but it's always worth tracking as a one-party consent state. And so the answer is no, you don't. Um, but I'm not going to give any legal advice on that point, but that's my understanding.
Great, thank you. Is there any possibility in the future that they would move to that second path you mentioned, rather than this costing out process, or we're set with costing out?
No, that was a contingency in the settlement that didn't happen because the PHP, I, w- I didn't sign a contract. It was a wonderful opportunity. It's gone. Chalk it up to another failure of the system.
Great, thank you. Um, all right, I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but the CMH told them that as a FMS, they need to calculate each individual's utilization rate, and then the utilization rate becomes the billing rate slash the person's budget. Is that correct? And if
I,
not,
I,
what should be done?
I don't know what that means. I
Okay.
don't know what utilization rate means.
All right. I'll see if there is any clarification added in the comments for that one. Thank you, Nick. Um, Thinking about the timeline for this, um, our CMHs allowing self-determined individuals to receive some sort of training or support to participate in this?
Um, I I don't know. I think it would depend on the CMH. I think this is where an independent facilitator can be really helpful, um, just in terms of navigating the process.
Okay, thank you. Mm, mm, mm. There are some individual questions in here that obviously you said earlier you wouldn't be able to answer, but generally, if you're asking for something and they're saying, and CMH is saying no, um, what could your next steps be?
Well, it depends on whether they're following the process. If they actually follow the process, which I highly doubt as to most of them, um, you're in a position to go to a hearing challenging discrete denials of an activity or transportation or whatever the case. If they're refusing to engage in the process at all, which is more likely, I suggest notifying MDHHS using that email address.
All right. So if we have some comments in the chat where people are on the HAB waiver and they've not received any information about what this process looks like. So their questions are like, is this now? What should we be doing now?
It is now, and it has been since October 1st. Um, and if you contact your CMH or you're at your IPOS renewal and you say, I want to do costing out, I want to have the PCP meeting I'm entitled to, and they say no, send contact the MDHHS uh, through the email address. You can let us know. We've been tracking this across the state, even if we don't necessarily have capacity to deal with it across the state right now. But no, we're doing what we can. We're focused on Washtenaw right now because it's the CMH that's a party to the case and it's the one that our plaintiffs need to enforce against to get relief.
Um, if there is money left over at the end of the budget um, year, um, can that money be used as an incentive for staff, or what happens at that point?
Somebody always asks about budget uh, surpluses, but I know people don't like calling them surpluses, for one. Generally, the money doesn't carry over from an authorization to another authorization. Uh, I have heard of people using it to pay bonuses to staff. I have heard of people doing other limited things that were all deemed permissible by the CMH, but I'm not really in a position to say more than that.
All right, thank you. Um, so you had mentioned an email address. I posted in the chat the habilitation supports waiver, self-directed frequently asked questions, which includes their contact info. So
Yeah, I think Sherry just put it in
yeah,
there.
that's the email that
Yeah.
that you're looking that you've been referencing.
Yep.
Mhm. All right. At this time, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. All right. Well, here another question came in. This is an individual. The person is an HSW recipient, self-directed for several years. For the upcoming planning year, the person was told by their case management that they need to create a budget first, and then the PCP will be facilitated. Is that correct, or what should she do now?
No, budget creation and IPOS development should happen together as part of the PCP process. The person should insist on the process working the way it's supposed to. I would come prepared, like I've been saying to the PCP meeting. You should know what you need and what you're requesting and be prepared to justify it. But the creation of the budget is something that happens as part of the PCP process.
All right. So we do not have the name of a specific person. We just have that email address
Right.
to provide.
And the email is monitored by, my understanding is it's monitored by a team of people at DHS and within the Attorney General's office. So I do think that's an appropriate place to send these things.
All right, thank you. Can you just talk a little bit more again about how to define medical necessary,
Well,
medically necessary?
yeah, again, it's the criteria that are in the behavioral health chapter. You have to be careful because there's all sorts of different medical necessity criteria in Medicaid. But the ones that are relevant here are in the behavioral health chapter, and they're the ones that are on the slide that I talked about. And the most important ones for these purposes are the ameliorate or diminish the symptoms of mental illness or IDD, and facilitate or help the person attain sufficient functioning to attain goals of community integration, inclusion, independence, etc. Those are the ones you're probably going to be most focused on. And those relate directly to CLS. I mean, that's what the service is, right? It's supposed to help people be independent, be engaged in their community.
All right, so I'm going to put the link to your PowerPoint presentation. And we've had some comments where CMH seems to have a different interpretation of the words. We can certainly take the facts that you've given us and bring our understanding of the definition of medically necessary.
It's truly unfortunate that this is a system where people have to fight against the entities that are supposed to be serving them. It's truly unfortunate. And you're going to have to. You're going to have to show up prepared. You're going to have to be ready to document and argue your case. And you're going to have to put your foot down when they try to do it outside of PCP. That's just a sad reality.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat right now. Just a bunch of thank yous for putting that information in a PowerPoint so we have information to come back to. Very helpful information and helping us figure out what we need to do moving forward.
Sounds
Um,
good.
well, thank you so much, Nick. We are on a little bit of a break here. Our presentations will resume with Jan Lampman at 10:45. So we'll see you back here shortly.
Thanks.
Welcome back, everybody. We're gonna get started with our next speaker, and Jan's here to talk about Medicaid appeals today. For folks that don't know, Lampman has dedicated more than 40 years to advocating for people with disabilities across Michigan. Um, she was a director at the ARC of Midland. She does lots of work for the ARC Michigan, and she works on a lot of determination initiatives across Michigan. She certainly has a very, very well-documented career, and we're happy that she's here to talk about the exciting topic of Medicaid appeals, although very important. And we're happy you're here today, Jan. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Yes, is one of my favorite topics. Not really. I talk about lots of really fun stuff, but this is an important topic. So we're gonna get through this here together. If I can get the slideshow to, there we go. Start. Okay, and subtitle, this little subtitle thingy will go away in a minute. So um, thank you all for joining on the call today. We're going to talk about Medicaid due process, right? We're going to talk about appealing. What can you do to assure that you get what you need, really, is what I really want to talk with you all about today. And hopefully, some of what I talk about will kind of tie in nicely with the things that Nick shared this morning. What I wanted to start with, though, is, and this sort of dovetails with what Nick said this morning, right? Everything really starts with good person-centered planning, right? Person-centered planning is the process by which an individual, that individual plan of service is created, right? Good planning includes system and non-system allies. I can't stress that enough, that when we're talking about this notion of person-centered planning, it's not just about sitting down with your case manager and someone who can make decisions at CMH about money, but it's about bringing people together who can help a person think about their vision for a good life and what that can look like and how we can get there, right? So good planning does get into some really specific detail about what makes a good life and what that person, that the focus person wants to do with their life, right? So if you go back to that medical necessity criteria, it's, about helping people to what? Have productivity, to be engaged and included in the community, to not let things related to their disability get in the way of those things. And so when we're talking about good person-centered planning, we're really talking about a person's legit dreams and goals and how they want their life to look, and then what supports do they need to have that good life, right? So, good person centered planning results in a good individual plan of service and a good budget that is connected to that plan and part of that plan. And as Nick said earlier, when someone had a question about, evidently there's a CMH that says you have to do the budget first and then you go to the plan. Well, that seems kind of backwards. How do you make a budget if you haven't decided yet what you want to put into your budget, right? And so it's really it's the planning process helps you end up with a good budget. It helps you end up with a good plan for your services. It also helps you, though, end up with non-system things that will help you have a better life, right? It helps you to make um, different kinds of connections in your community. It helps you to build your relationship with the people that do, in fact, support you. So that person-centered planning process isn't just about getting an individual plan of service and a budget. It's about really all of the elements that go into planning for a really good life. And it's important to make sure that you've done a good job at this front end so that if you do have a disagreement with your CMH and you have to appeal, you've got everything down and recorded and memorialized in your plan notes, in your plan of service, and in your budget. So, what should be in that plan of service, right? Well, the individual plan of service needs to start with the person's goals for a good life. And I'm saying that because it seems like, well, that seems obvious, except that I've seen lots of plans and the goal is something like they will see their therapist 3 times a month, or the goal has to do with a service rather than with something the person wants to have as part of their life, right? And so those goals really need to be, what is it that I want to be engaged in and be a part of that's going to help me have a good life, right? Maybe, someone wants to be a homeowner, or maybe someone wants to start a small business or have a certain kind of job, or, whatever it might be, finish school, whatever it might be. Then those objectives within that plan of service need to be some measurable things that help the person move in the direction of that goal, right? So if you want to be I don't know, you want to be a podcaster, then you need to have some action items, measurable action items that are going to help you get to being a podcaster. Because you can talk about being a podcaster till the cows come home, and that's not going to make you a podcaster, right? You have to, I don't know, learn how to use the equipment to do a podcast. You have to, figure out how to pick a subject for your podcast. You have to maybe talk to other podcasters to find out what they've done to be successful and build an audience, right? So the objectives are the like actions that you're going to take to help you move towards that thing that is your goal. And that's where you might need support, right? When you're working on those objectives, that's where you're going to need what we call interventions or supports, and that represents the things that the system can put in place to help you achieve those goals and objectives. So, if you have a goal to be a podcaster, I don't know, that's like, I'm so focused on that right now today. But if you have a goal to be a podcaster and you've decided that to start that out, like an objective that you need to have in your plan, to be able to start learning about being a podcaster is to learn how to use the equipment, for example, then your interventions need to be that you're going to, I don't know, take a class on how to use the equipment, or that you're going to go with your CLS staff to another podcaster's, you know, pod and see how they do it, or whatever that might be, right? Or maybe you and your CLS staff are going to research stuff on the internet together. Whatever the support is that you need to be able to do the thing that helps you move toward the goal. And then finally, any needed support needs to be included in that plan. And you need to describe how those supports are going to help you to achieve the goals. So, for example, if you want to be a podcaster about, I don't know, um, Michigan State sports, you want a podcast about all things Michigan State sports, then you probably need access to Michigan State sports. And so how will your supports be put in place in such a way that you can gain access to that subject matter that you need to be able to learn the skill that you want to have, so that you can do the thing that is your goal. So that's where we see people putting specific activities maybe into their goals. I'm going to use one example that I hope is okay. I'm not going to name names or anything. There's a young man who's really interested. He's really interested in like pasta and how it's made and all the things about it, right? And there's this certain pasta store, or this certain store that like makes their pasta in-house. And so he wanted to be able to like make a trip over to that store, I don't know, once a week or something to buy his pasta, but also see and learn and experience how they make the pasta. One could say, well, gee, you can buy good pasta at the Whole Foods down the street, or you could just buy pasta, Aldi down the street. But it's not the same as going to the specific place that makes the pasta by hand, fresh every day, right? And if you're interested in learning about that process, you got to go to a place where they do that. So, you know what? Then we need to put in the plan extra time and extra mileage for the support to take him to that specific location to learn about that specific thing. So that's the kind of stuff and the kind of detail you want to have in your plan. Again, when you've got good detail in your plan, when we have to get to, or if we have to get to Medicaid fair hearing, we're going to have the data to show why this is something that's necessary for the person to achieve their goals. So some kinds of system supports that are necessary to achieve the goals, right? We talk about medical necessity. So I'm going to bring up medical necessity again, and I'm going to be more simple in my explanation. Nick and I sometimes speak together at the same time, and he'll always have like the real language, and then I'll have the like, this is the layman's version, if you will. So I'm going to have a simplified version of of what medical necessity is, and that they're really supports that are designed to assist that beneficiary, that person, right, to achieve their goals of community inclusion, participation, independence, recovery, or productivity, right? So if you're thinking about like what medical necessity means, it's the support you need so that you can be included in your community and that you can participate and that you can be independent in whatever that means to you, right? Because independence doesn't mean you can do a task by yourself. It means that you are independent from the authority or control or time frame of others, right? So like for my sister, independence means she decides when she's going to get help to get out of bed instead of it being on the timeline of the staff when they can show up to get her out of bed, right? Because if she has to wait for their timeline, she's not independent. But if they come to her when she wants them, that is increasing her independence. So it's that how we define independence also becomes really important. And then that notion of productivity, right? So if there's a young man who wants to learn how to make pasta, that's a pretty cool, that's being productive, right? If you're making your own fresh pasta. Um, and so that's what medical necessity really is. And so when you are getting yourself prepared for, writing a really good plan so that hopefully you don't have to appeal, or if you're trying to get ready to appeal, you want to really focus on how the thing you're asking for meets this criteria of helping the person to be included in their community, to participate, to experience independence, recovery, or productivity. Those are just really important. Um, it's an important frame to put around all of the support you're asking for and seeking. So I want to talk a little bit about goals and medical necessity because I've been hearing some things out in the world and sometimes they get me distressed. And so I want to just sort of clear up some misconceptions. It is never appropriate for anyone to say that someone's goal in life is not medically necessary, right? So if someone says they have a goal to, I don't know, do podcasting, I'll stick with podcasting. And then the CMH says, well, yeah, but that's not medically necessary. Like you don't need to be a podcaster. That's not, no, that's not a thing. Maybe a support you're asking for may or may not be medically necessary, but a person's goal, what they state as their goal is their goal, period, the end. It has nothing to do with medical necessity. Medical necessity is connected to the services that are provided by Medicaid funding. That's it. That's what they're connected, what that definition is connected to. So as such, specific requests for service can be examined based on medical necessity criteria, but a person's goals are not. So any requested service that you ask for needs to meet that medical necessity criteria. But let's go back and look at it again, right? It's supports that allow for community inclusion, participation, independence, recovery, or productivity, right? And so if the thing you're asking for is something that is needed in order for the person to engage in their community in these ways, then you can say, okay, that feels medically necessary, right? It is important that all of your requests are clearly tied to your goals and objectives, right? So sometimes I've been in meetings where a very exhausted parent says, look, I just need 30 hours a week of CLS. I just need 30 hours a week of CLS. Okay. How is that tied to that person's good life and how is that 30 hours of CLS going to help that person meet a goal, fulfill their objectives, right? So you want to make sure that any service you're asking for is very clearly tied to the goal and to the objectives that you're trying to meet to get towards that goal. Some other things that I wanted to just point out is that the PIHP CMH can deny services that are deemed ineffective for a given condition based on professionally and scientifically recognized and accepted standards of care, right? So, I've not really seen this one used because I've not really seen people asking for things that are like specifically deemed ineffective for a given condition. But that could be something that gets denied. Things that are experimental or investigational in nature could be denied by the CMH or the PIHP. And this is the one, this number 3 bullet is the one where we get into the conversations. And I think Nick alluded to it a bit in his presentation as well. the PIHP can deny services for which there exists another appropriate, efficacious, less restrictive, and cost-effective service setting or support that otherwise satisfies the standards for medically necessary services. And this is the part where, especially when you're talking about um, activities, for example, or maybe goods and services, or some of those things that are not within the traditional service models, where you really have to have a robust conversation. So, for example, going back to my pasta example, because it's a real example, going back to my pasta store example, the statement was made, you can buy pasta at stores that are much closer than in distance than this pasta store, this certain pasta store that was, I think, in a next door, like in a town next door or something. However, and so you would say, oh, well, see, there exists another appropriate, less restrictive, cost effective, this in this case, cost effective service. Well, sure, you could use less mileage and go to this other store, but you're not getting any of the things that you get when you go over to the store that's in the town next, the town over, where you're seeing them make the pasta and you're learning how to make pasta. So sometimes you'll hear CMHs be pushing back. This is where they're pushing back a lot on the activities in the Waskell settlement, but even sometimes we'll push back on things you're asking for just in general, right? Is that they're saying, well, but there's a less expensive way we can do this. And so the challenge is to say, okay, maybe there is something that's less expensive, but does it really meet the need? Does it really help get to the goal? Is this less expensive thing really the thing that's going to help this person, fulfill those objectives or work on those objectives and get to that goal? I like sometimes I'll hear like, in like entertainment kinds of things. Well, you can just go to a local high school game and not go to the Tigers game, or you can just go to, um, the free music on Friday nights in Midland and not go to the concert at the casino. And so if you want to make the case for the concert at the casino, you have to be able to connect that going to that specific activity and how is it different than going to the concert on Main Street on Friday night, and what benefit does the person get that they couldn't get at the concert on Main Street on Friday night, right? You have to be able to connect what you're asking for to how it's going to help you meet your goals. And there are just things that there isn't a substitute, right? There are just certain activities that there might be something free, but that free thing is just not a substitute for the thing that you're asking for some money to pay for. And you need to be able to, though, articulate that. The PHP is also allowed to employ methods to determine amount, scope, and duration of services, including things like prior authorization for certain kinds of services, those utilization reviews, the assessment and referral, and some gatekeeping arrangements. But it's very important to note that utilization management cannot override the person-centered planning process. It can't just unilaterally remove things out of a person-centered plan, right? And so while CMHs absolutely have the right to have a UM department, they don't have a right for that UM department to overstep, right, and take things out of a plan. If something's going to be denied, there needs to be that adverse benefit determination, right? And so we'll get into that next. So some other things to consider is that the CMH or PIHP cannot deny services solely based on cost, amount, scope, or duration of those services. It needs to be conducted on an individualized basis, right? So like there are some communities, I'm not naming names, but there are some communities where it seems as though every single person who still lives at home with their parents gets the same exact amount of CLS authorized for them. I can't imagine that every one of those people has the exact same amount, scope, and type of need that they would all have the exact same amount of CLS authorized to them. My guess is that that is not being, the determination for those services are not being conducted on an individualized basis. And so we need to make sure that it isn't just that everybody gets the same thing. Every person needs something a little different. And so CMHs can't deny services because someone's asking for something a little bit different. Also, PIHP decisions, specifically including utilization management, cannot replace the person-centered planning process. It just can't. For example, they cannot remove or change a beneficiary's goals. They cannot say that they will put in like I actually saw this happen with someone very deeply close to me where they switched out the thing we asked for something less costly. They don't get to just do that unilaterally. That has to come back to the planning team to discuss and have that conversation, right? Now, it can give you ideas of less costly alternatives that can accomplish the same goals, and then you can talk it through, right? Um, Edits to the person's plan of service require that plan of service to be reopened. So again, like people who are deciding on amount, scope, and duration don't get to change something that's in the plan. That has to come back to the planning table to happen. So what if something that you request is denied? Here we are. Here we're to the part where I was actually asked to speak about. You have due process rights. First, you have that option of a local appeal, and sometimes that's referred to as a second opinion. That's what some CMHs call it, but it's really a local appeal. And then next, you have an option to appeal to an administrative law judge, or you can ask for mediation before filing that formal appeal with the administrative law judge. And I've done that a few times, and I actually find that I've enjoyed the mediation process, and in the couple of cases where I've been part of it, folks have really been happy with the outcome. So if CMH denies your request, what does that look like? Well, if CMH decides not to provide a service you requested, or if they decide to give you less than you requested, they have to provide you with what's called an adverse benefit determination. That document will tell you, it will give you instructions for filing your local appeal and an appeal with the administrative law judge. That's your due process rights. And so if you're denied ever a service or a support or something you've requested, they have to give you that adverse benefit determination. I will tell you that sometimes people will make a request and then somehow it never makes it to in writing, and then they don't get their adverse benefit determination. We'll talk a little later about what to do in that situation because I'm certain that people have had that happen to them. So for the local appeal, when you file that, it's important to explain what you requested and why you feel it meets the definition of medical necessity, right? If there's information that wasn't included, like in the original plan, you can share it at this time, right? So like sometimes there will be this robust discussion about why you want a certain service, but then in the plan, it's maybe only one or two sentences. And so you can expand on that when you're doing your local appeal to say, hey, this is why I think this is medically necessary. If the local appeal officer agrees that you should get the service, then it can be authorized. And I have seen that happen. Some people will say, oh, you never win at the local appeal, but I've seen it happen. The local appeal can also result in you being asked to go back to the planning process and add more detail about how the thing that you are requesting will help meet the goals, right? So quite a few times when I've kind of come on board to help someone, they'll be in that local appeal process and the appeals officer will just say, listen, we don't have enough, there isn't enough here to justify what you're asking for. Go back and get more detailed. And so that can be something that you would choose to do so that you can have that more robust conversation like Nick's been talking about and I've been talking about. So when you appeal to the administrative tribunal,
Jan, can I ask a question about the local appeal, the slide that you were just on?
sure.
If you could go back and just talk about what does a local appeal look like and like who is involved and who is the
Sure.
officer? Thank you.
Yep. So the local appeal is with your local CMH, right? So and again, different CMHs do it differently. So there's a one PIHP where if let's say you're in county A, then they're going to have someone from county B or C, one of the other counties, have a look at it, right? So when you do a local appeal, somebody who was not a part of making the decision to say yes or no has to take a look. I'm going to use CMH for Central Michigan as an example because that's the CMH that I, you know, lit in. And so I'm very familiar with how that works. And so, like recently, there was a situation where a person was denied, they were denied eligibility for services. And so they filed, that local appeal, like, no, we think we're eligible. And so someone other than the people who were involved in the original conversations and decision making, who happened to be at a different county, sat down and looked at the all of the documentation, and they were the ones that, like, made the local appeal decision. In that case, it was found that, oh yep, you really are eligible, we're sorry, come on in, welcome in. um and so when you do a local appeal, there's usually like a customer service office, or appeals office at your local CMH. And so those are the staff that are going to be looking at those. They're not the people, they're not utilization management. They're not the case manager or case manager supervisor, right? They're people that are completely separate um, from the, from the process that you went through to get to that place. Does that answer the question?
There's one follow-up question. Are you
Okay.
required to do that local appeal or can you go straight to the Medicaid hearing?
So you really need to do that local appeal first. And then you can go to your Medicaid hearing. It used to be back in the day, you could just go straight to Medicaid fair hearing. But I can't remember how long ago that was changed, that you need to do the local appeal. That's usually very quick. They have a very short window of time to get that. You submit that appeal and then they've only got, like I want to say it's 14 days. It might be even less than that though, to go through and give you an answer, yes or no, so that you can then move on to the fair hearing appeal. Now, when you do a local appeal, let's say that they're going to reduce your hours. Let's say you're getting a reduction of services that you had previously and you disagree with that. When you file the appeal, if you ask for them to maintain the services where at the current level, you can get the services will continue at the current level until you're through all of the appeals process, including local and fair hearing.
Okay, one last question, Jan, before I let you move on. When you say local, do you mean your local CMH
Yes.
or the PIHP?
So again, each of the PIHP is set up a little differently in different places in the state, to tell you the truth. So, like over on the west side of the state, I've worked with families. I'll just give the example. Years ago, there was a Kent County appeal. We did the local appeal and it went to the LRE, which is their PIHP, to be heard. And then the family prevailed and they got the service that they were seeking. With CMH for Central, when I recently participated in an appeal, it was within CMH for Central. It went to their customer services department and was heard by folks in that department. So it's how each CMH has it set up. I think there was a point in time, I don't know, there was a CMH at one point, they don't do this anymore, but there was a CMH that actually contracted with a third party that did those. So it's really how that your local CMH and PIHP have set it up. But you have that local first. You have an opportunity to tell them all the things you need to tell them. They either agree or disagree with you, and then you're able to move on. So if we could just, are we ready to move on?
Yes,
Back.
thank you, Jan.
Okay, sorry. All right, so if your local appeal is denied, then you can file that appeal with the administrative law judge. Again, it's important to explain clearly why you think CMH made the wrong decision. Meaning, how will this service best meet your needs or help you achieve your goals, right? And so sometimes now they're not supposed to, but I still see, I'm sorry to tell you, Nick, I still see sometimes CMHs that will just write, it's not medically necessary as their reason instead of going into some detail, right? And so a lot of times if I'm trying to talk someone through filing their appeal because they want to just do it themselves without, without the help of an attorney or whatever, I might send them towards or give them some language right out of the Medicaid provider manual that makes their case, that helps make their case, right? So a lot of times I'll help people find the excerpt in the Medicaid manual about what you can use CLS for, or what what respite is for, or what overnight health and safety is for, so that they can tie what they're asking for to what the Medicaid manual actually says. Um, you're going to want to send in, when you send in your appeal, you're going to want to attach copies of the plan of service, the denials, and any other supporting documents that you feel you need to send. And then a hearing date is set. I just want you to know that this is a real court proceeding, so court rules apply, which means that there's no just like chiming in. Like I've seen people get yelled at for just trying to chime in the middle of someone's testimony. You cannot do that. It's a real court proceeding. Um, you'll be able to call witnesses. You'll be able to enter documentation into the record for the judge to consider. CMH will also be able to call witnesses and also cross-examine your witnesses, as you will be able to cross-examine theirs. Sometimes, most times that I've seen, CMH is represented by an attorney. You can also hire an attorney, though it's not required, and I've seen lots of families go to hearing without an attorney. It's just important for you to know up front that a lot of times CMH is going to have an attorney that's representing them. And um, so that can make it a little bit more challenging, because what happens whenever there are, no offense, Nick, you know that I love you deeply, but whenever attorneys are in the room, then the vocabulary changes, and the sentence structure changes, and it's not plain language. I'm just going to say it that way. And so sometimes it gets a little people can feel intimidated or overwhelmed when the hearing starts to go in that direction. Although I will tell you that the ALJ judges that I've been in front of in the past have always they've been mindful of that, and they've been pretty supportive of helping somebody who's not represented by an attorney to make sure they're understanding all of the things that are being said, and also giving them a little bit of leeway with with how they're presenting evidence, or how they're presenting their witnesses. But that's important to know. Some important timelines. If you wish for services to continue that have been reduced or terminated while you're in the appeal process, you need to make that request within 10 days from the date that is on the letter telling you about the reduction or termination. It's from the date that's on the letter, not the date you got it in the mail. That's really important to note, because sometimes people will say, yeah, but I didn't get the letter until, whatever, 5 days later. It's the date on the letter. And then you have, let's say that it wasn't a reduction or a termination, so it's like a new service you were requesting, or either way, you have 120 days to file for a state fair hearing after the date of the letter telling you that your services were denied, reduced, or terminated. And then after you file that appeal and you go through that process and you have your hearing and everything, you'll receive a decision and order within 90 days. I've usually seen it way sooner than that. The judges usually don't wait the whole 90 days. You can get an expedited hearing. Like if your health is at risk without the services you've requested, you may request a fast hearing. With a fast hearing, the judge has to give you an answer within 72 hours. Now, the judge can say that they need more information, and so that could increase the time frame to 14 days. But those fast hearings it's either 72 hours or up to 14 days, and then you're going to have an answer. Again, you have to be able to show, though, that you have some kind of health risk or a risk to your well-being or safety, if the situation doesn't get resolved quickly. Otherwise, they're going to just make you go through the traditional process that can take up to 90 days. Mediation is also an option prior to going in front of the administrative law judge, and you'll be asked, you'll be given that as an option. Hey, you could do mediation. A mediator is a neutral party that helps people with opposing views to come together and compromise. So the mediator doesn't make the decision. The mediator doesn't have that kind of authority, but they're skilled people. If you've ever been in mediation, those mediators are highly skilled at helping people to have productive conversation in a way that can help them potentially come to some kind of either consensus or compromise. Mediation is voluntary for both the CMH and the person served. So both parties need to agree to mediation. Once you do, though, agree to something, like if you do a mediation agreement, that is binding upon both parties. So it is, while the mediator doesn't make decisions and they don't have authority, that process can end in an agreement that is binding on both parties. If you can't come to agreement in mediation, you still have that option to move forward with your appeal in front of the judge. Some things to consider. The best way to win an appeal is to not have to file an appeal. So thoughtful person-centered planning, I think, is the key to both avoiding an appeal and winning it if you do have to go to appeal. Um, so when you're in that person-centered planning process, I think it's really important to being open to look at all options to help you achieve your goals, right? It's important to look at both non-system supports and services, as well as system supports. My sister Mary Wheeler says that a good life is dependent on more than what Medicaid can provide. She says that all the time in her own way, sometimes using swear words. Um, if something's being denied, another thing that you can do is ask to see the rule. Like sometimes you'll be in a meeting with a case manager and they'll say, oh, yeah, we don't do that. We can't do that. And when that happens, before you even get done with the person-centered planning process, you want to ask to see the rule. So if you're being told that something can't be done, get the rule, read the rule, see if you agree with what they're saying. Sometimes they're right. Many times people are not right about that. Like sometimes we think through our rules. I don't know why we think this, but sometimes we think that something's a rule when it's really not. And so it's really important to like if someone's telling you that you can't do something, ask them to back that up with some facts. Ask them to back that up with the rule. And then be prepared with your own data, documentation, citations for the Medicaid rules, right? So if you feel like either you're in an appeal process or you feel like it's going to be one of those situations where you're asking for something that the CMH doesn't know how to provide and they think they can't provide, then you can come prepared to show them how it can be done. So, like one of the things that I like to do, um, and my children benefit from this greatly, is that I like to come into the meeting knowing that, okay, this is what you want. Okay, well, here's the rule that says you can have what you want. So that if anybody tries to say no, I'm already ready before we're in the middle of the planning process and I'm already ready with my data, my documentation, and my citations that says, no, this is why we can do this. And so when you can, it's really great to be able to do that. So there are lots of places that you can find help and resources, and I've just put some of them down, but like the Arc of Michigan has lots of great resources for helping you think about person-centered planning and what that looks like and how to do good quality person-centered planning. Disability Rights Michigan, I know that Nick said that they're over struggling and burdened and all of the things, but they actually have some really great stuff on their website, and general information that can be very, very helpful when you're trying to sort of navigate the system and navigate Medicaid appeals. There are also many local chapters of the ARC that have advocates that are willing to walk alongside you and help you with it. Not all chapters have that capacity, but many do. There are also local disability networks, the Centers for Independent Living, that have advocates that are able to help with like system navigation and system advocacy that you could find some support from. You can find resources at the Developmental Disabilities Council, the Developmental Disabilities Institute. The Developmental Disabilities Institute, in fact, has a list of people who do independent facilitation around the state of Michigan, because I do think that having a facilitator help you with that planning process, help you to really stay focused on the big picture, the goals and how we're moving toward the goals and how we're connecting to the broader community is really important. And so DDI has a really great list of folks that might be able to provide that service and support for people, along with lots of really great person-centered planning tools, as does the Developmental Disabilities Council. Now, MDHHS also has a beneficiary helpline that you could call if you have questions or are just wondering things about like what does this mean in the Medicaid manual, or you know how does this work? How do we make sure that, the PIHP and the CMH are helping us in the way that they need to? I've had people call there, like one time there was a tiny CMH, a case manager who'd probably been there for a couple of months, and she said to the family, "Yeah, we don't do respite here." Well, she didn't really mean that because obviously respite is a service that everyone across the state of Michigan who receives, this specific set of supports can access wherever you live if you're eligible. And so what she really meant is we don't have any respite providers, but the way it came out was like, yeah, that's not a service we offer here. And so the person immediately called the MDHHS beneficiary helpline and got clarification on that. So there's lots of resources out there, places that you can go to get your questions answered or get the assistance that you might, need so that you can really um, have a number one, get the things that you need in your plan, because that's really the goal, right? I mean, I get it. Sometimes we have to go to appeal, and I don't ever like when that's the case, but we sometimes do because we can agree. But there are resources out there to help you try to navigate all of that. And so I just wanted to make sure that folks knew that. And now I'm ready. I think I'm so fast. I'm so sorry, folks, but I whip through material. So are there questions?
So now would be a great time to type any questions that you may have for Jan in the chat. A copy of her PowerPoint presentation is available at the same ARC Michigan link that I shared earlier. So in your examples, Jan, you've said this particular CMH, things are run this way, might be different at another. Can you help us understand why counties are allowed to do different things? It makes it seem like it really depends on where you live, what you're able to get.
You're killing me. Well, so, okay. So there is the Medicaid provider manual that tells us as beneficiaries um what are we eligible for? What are people in the state of Michigan who have specific disabilities or specific needs? What are all of the things that they're eligible for? And the things that are in that Medicaid manual should be available to anyone, no matter where they live in the state of Michigan. And I said the word should because we all know the reality is, right? Number one, we have shortages of things. We don't have enough people doing direct support to be able to have enough direct support professionals for all of the need across the state of Michigan. We know that especially in northern Michigan, it's really hard to find clinical services such as, equine therapy, music therapy, recreational therapy, even therapists. Um, Definitely CLS workers. So we know that sometimes there are just shortages, and so people aren't able to access things in their community due to those shortages. And sometimes the way that CMHs manage the shortages can differ, right? Um, but then you've got the Medicaid manual. Everybody's eligible for that. And then the Department of Health and Human Services, right, creates contracts or enters into contracts with the prepaid inpatient health plans across the state saying, hey, you are responsible for pulling together these community mental health entities and for making sure that beneficiaries in your region get the services and supports that they need. And there are things in that contract that the department sort of mandates, right? Number one, following the Medicaid provider manual. There are some other policies and procedures that the PIHPs need to follow or are supposed to be following per the contract, including things like engaging in person-centered planning, offering independent facilitation, things like that. And then those PIHPs then have contracts with the CMHs. When you go back up to that MDHHS and PIHP contract, there are things that the department says you absolutely have to do this. And then there are things that the department says you have to do this, but you can do it in a way that makes sense to you. I mean, that's not exactly the words, but like there's a certain amount of authority or autonomy given to the PIHPs and the CMHs for different aspects of that service delivery. So like one of the things, for example, that is not mandated by the state is provider rates, how much providers get paid in any community. And I'm talking about all kinds of providers, right? Case management, therapists, PTOT, all CLS, all of those things. And so, you can find big disparity between CMHs that are right next to each other in rates that providers get paid, for example, because there's that autonomy to be able to make those decisions locally. So part of the reason that it can look really different at different CMHs is that there are some authorities that are legitimately given to the local CMH or the PIHP to have that autonomy to decide how they want to do it. And then I'm just going to say this out loud because sometimes Jan Lampman just says things out loud. Sometimes they just do it the way they want to because they're doing it the way they want to, even though the contract might say something different. We all have seen that, so we might as well just notice that elephant in the room. In those cases, when it's a situation where a CMH or a PIHP is doing something that is different than what either the Medicaid manual or their contract says, right? That's when your due process rights come into play.
All right, thank you, Jen. I will watch for any follow-up thoughts or questions on understanding that process. We do have a question. Can you talk a little bit about what is a support broker? What
Oh,
do they do, and how could they help people navigate?
yes. So a support broker is a person is a service that is available through folks that self-direct, and it's not just people on the HAB waiver. Anybody who self-directs, um, by the way, everything I talked about is for everybody, right? But everybody who self-directs can have the option of engaging a support broker. And a support broker is someone that can help you in any variety of ways. So some people have support brokers that are kind of like an HR person, right? They help the individual served to be a good employer. They help them with recruiting. Maybe they sit alongside them when they're interviewing or doing training with the staff or making sure that the staff are filling out all the paperwork correctly, right? So they're kind of helping manage that employment piece of a self-determination arrangement. Sometimes brokers will help manage the budget piece of a self-determination arrangement, right? Like my son Tim, his support broker sits down with him and they go through his support budget to help. She's helping him to manage that and make sure he stays within his budget. Sometimes support brokers can have different kinds of tasks. Like I know that in Wayne County, I've met a few support brokers who specifically help people when they're trying to get home modifications through the HAB waiver, or when they're trying to access and find a good behavioral therapist or behavioral psychologist to write a behavior plan, when they're trying to find resources. For the longest time, for many years, there were a few support brokers in the community where I live who specifically were working on helping people make connections that weren't within the system, like helping people find resources and connections outside of the behavioral health system. So brokers can do any number of things to help someone kind of manage the resources and the supports that will help them get to their good life. And that is a Medicaid billable service through self-direction, and it's paid for. I mean, the billing code is the same as your support coordinator billing code. So brokers, support coordinators, case managers are all under that same billing code, if anybody cares.
Well, yes, that actually was one of the questions that we had
Oh,
come
okay.
through. So thank you, Jan. Excuse me. The next question. All right. Support broker sounds great. Nobody's ever offered this to me. What is the language that a person should use if they're interested in obtaining that service?
I would like a support broker to help me with, and then whatever it is you want them to help you with. I mean, that's literally it. Um, it's the support broker. If you're doing self-direction, support brokers are referred to in the technical guidance for self-directed services. So you could, reference that document and say, hey, the technical guidance says I could have a support broker, and here's some of the things that I would like my support broker to do. So can we put that in my budget? Can we put that in my plan and my budget?
Um, uh, support broker could be for an adult or a minor.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
Um,
So I see there's a couple of moms that I've worked with down in like who have the SED, or either the children's waiver or the SED waiver, one of those, kind of high acuity kind of situations. And the mom has a support broker to help her manage because she's got like a bunch of staff that are coming and going all the time. And there's just a lot to manage. And so they have a support broker to help mom with that managing employer role.
all right, thank you for that. Um, we did have a tip in the chat that folks have been talking about the Medicaid manual and how to understand that. You can definitely find a copy of it online. If you save a PDF, save it as a PDF. You can do your search feature and read through what it says about habilitation supports waiver.
Yeah, I don't know that I would necessarily save it as a PDF because it changes several times a year. And so if you just bookmark the website, then you can go back to it so that you have the most up-to-date information. Plus,
Okay, thank
it's a giant document, so I feel like saving it as a PDF would take up a lot of space.
Okay, perhaps someday we can do a quick tutorial on the manual.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
because it sounds overwhelming. Um,
it,
to
it- you
what-
know, it feels overwhelming, but I do think that, I saw Carolyn put in in her tip is that idea that there is like a table of contents kind of a thing that you can use, and you can also there's a search feature so that if you're looking for something specific, like say goods and services, you can type that in the search feature and it'll bring it up. But yeah, I think that would be really cool to do a tutorial sometime on how to use that manual.
All right. Another question. Oh, here's another tip. Don't try to print it. That's a good
Yeah.
tip. Thank you. Um,
It's lots of pages.
all right. What can you do if the PIHP refuses to attend the person-centered planning meetings to set the budget?
Ooh, yeah. So the new language, this is for the HAB waiver specifically, but that new language that has been put into the Medicaid manual says that somebody who can make the decision has to be part of the process, right? And so, I mean, it feels like they're denying you your rights that are written into the Medicaid provider manual, right? So, I mean, I guess I don't know if Nick's still on the call or not, but he might be able to sort of answer that from a legal standpoint. But I mean, I would be making noise. I'd be calling customer service at the department. I would be, having conversations with that PHP asking, why are you not, here's the language in the Medicaid manual. Why are you not doing it? Um, I have to tell you, I've not experienced, I have not directly asked for someone to come and they've refused yet. Now, I know that lots of families that I support have asked for people to come and they've refused. And so I just think it's about being persistent. I think sometimes when you have an independent facilitator helping with the process, that outside person sometimes can, um, if the CMH folks that might not understand the process, whatever, see that extra set of eyes and they might be more willing to come to the table. I'm not sure. Um, but there is an obligation for someone who makes a decision to be part of the process. That's what I would say.
Thank you for that language. Um, I am not seeing any more questions in the chat right now. Um, thank you, Jan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Remember, we are back here next Friday and then the last Friday of the month for the ARC Michigan Disability Policy webinar series. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, Jan.
I, oh, was there something? Oh, that's just the thank you.